So how does aspects of a more traditional, when you avoid typology, what are one of the aspects where you end up falling short? I think one of the areas where you're going to end up falling short is if you read in Matthew chapter 2, it says this, referring to, Jesus was born and Joseph has a dream, and it says this, "Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, 'Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him.' And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, 'Out of Egypt I called my son.'" So if you even if you have your little English Bible, there should be some sort of note there. It tells you, all right, what prophet is he referring to? And you look down, it says Hosea 11:1. You go back to Hosea 11:1. It says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And so what Hosea 11:1 is talking about is referring back to the Exodus. And basically, prior to God bringing Israel up out of Egypt, God identifies the Israelites as my firstborn son. And then he ends up bringing them out. So, and out of Egypt, I called my son. It's literally the Exodus is what Hosea 11:1 is referring to. And yet here in Matthew chapter 2, it says that Jesus is a fulfillment. Out of Egypt, I called my son. So if you just have a strict grammatical historical approach, what's going on in a Hosea 11:1, you're going to miss the idea that this isn't a prophecy about Jesus. It's a reference back to Egypt. But what the typological approach is going to do is it's going to enable you to see that from Adam being God's firstborn son in Genesis chapter 5, Adam is identified as God's son. And then when you get to Genesis chapter 2, I believe it is, or Exodus chapter 1 or chapter 2, it's going to identify Israel as being God's firstborn son. And so what typology is going to enable you to do is kind of camp out on this idea of firstborn son, or the idea of being the son of God. And what you're going to have are these connections between Adam being the son of God, Israel being son of God, and Jesus being identified as ultimately the only begotten son of God, the unique son of God. So in what way is Jesus fulfillment of Hosea 11:1? Well, he's the true Israelite. He's the true son of God who does still go down to Egypt, and all that Exodus language of what's going on there is a type and shadow of what was to come in Jesus Christ. So it's still real. It's still what happened in history. This did happen with the Israelites. And that's going to be one of the areas where we want our typology to still camp out on, is the reality that these are still historical events. They're no less historical because they're typological. So God really had a group of people who are the Jews down in Egypt that he brought up and out of Egypt and into the promised land. Similarly, God's firstborn son, his preeminent son, his only begotten son, goes down into Egypt. Then ultimately, he's also restored back into the promised land. And so these things are going to end up tying in well to even Paul's ideas in 1 Corinthians 15, where it says, I pass on you that which of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, he was raised up on the third day according to the scriptures. And once you begin to understand the typology of the firstborn son throughout the book, especially the book of Genesis, Exodus, you have this death and resurrection narrative of God's firstborn son, or the preeminent son. And so the way that we know that, typology is just kind of inbred and kind of the air that the biblical authors breathe, is that when we read things like Matthew chapter 2 and how Jesus fulfilled Hosea 11, we have one or two options. We can either say Matthew completely butchered it, he misunderstood what Hosea was talking about, or we can say, no, Matthew knew exactly what he was talking about, and going from the Exodus on down, these things are referring to the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Christ. And I think a far safer place to land as a Christian is on the idea that the biblical authors know what they're talking about, and they understood it typologically, which isn't only, it's a type of the things to come, but it's also predictive of the life of the Messiah.